All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a moment. All right. Awesome. So good evening and welcome. Thanks for coming to the Hive this evening of this presentation for our Laurentians Learn session. My name is Victoria Lederer, and I work in Laurentian Engagement. A few housekeeping notes as we begin this evening. We are recording this session so that others who are not able to make it can view the session at a later time. If you have not done so yet, if you hover over your Brady box and hit the 3 dots, you can rename yourself. So we just ask if you want to put your class year in, that would be awesome. You know, we want to know who's tuning in this evening. We do have a few pre-submitted questions that people indicated when they signed up. So Aswini will be addressing those. But if you do have questions that come up during her presentation, feel free to drop those in the chat. You can either direct message me or just drop them in the general chat. And then at the end, when we do reach our more formal Q&A portion, if you go to the bottom in reactions, you'll be able to raise your hand, and that's when I'll be able to call you, and you can turn yourself off mute and ask your question live. So at any point this evening, if you have any questions, feel free to private message me, and I'll look to address those. All right, so with our housekeeping address, let's turn to what we're learning about this evening. So I'd first like to thank the Alumni Executive Council, specifically Anne McGrath-McManus, Stevie Michelson, and our student delegates that are part of their committee for developing the great list of speakers to engage with in this Laurentians Learn series. Tonight, we have the pleasure of learning from Dr. Aswini Pai, Associate Professor and Co-Chair of Biology. Dr. Pai earned her Bachelor of Science in Zoology at Cochrane College, a Master's in Wildlife Science at the Wildlife Institute of India, and her PhD in Plant Biology at Ohio University. Dr. Pai regularly teaches general biology, ethnobotany, tropical ecology, medicinal plant ecology, and forest ecology of Asia at St. Lawrence. She has conducted field work in India, Nepal, North America, and Borneo. Dr. Pai is interested in the ecology of economically important plant species, especially medicinal plants, both in the wild and in agroecosystems, and usually has 2 to 4 students conducting research with her in her lab every semester. So now let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Pai as she begins her talk, The Buzz About Bees, Pollination in Kitchen and Ornamental Gardens.
Hi, everybody. And I just want to say, Victoria, I just realized you took the description from my website, and I have to update the information there. So there's a couple of names that I recognize out here. Sam, it's so good to see you. You know, and some of what I'm going to present is work that Sam Hub also did with me in my lab. And I see Taylor Hall. I recognize a couple of names, you know, and these are all past students of mine, and it gives me great joy. I'm very nostalgic about that. Okay. So what I would like to do is go through a set of PowerPoint slides, and I am going to be telling you about the work that I have done in the North Country. And I do work on medicinal plants. I also work on agroecology, all right? You know, ecosystems where humans, because of socio-cultural reasons, they either cultivate plants for consumption or simply because they like cultivating plants, you know. And I'll get into what that is about. But I got fascinated by bees a few years back. And, I have a very broad degree in biology. I'm trained in both zoology and botany. I went to Canada, trained myself on bees, and came back and started teaching my students about how to identify bees. And just to clarify one thing, I will answer some of the questions people put forth. I do not study the honeybee. What I study are the native wild bees of the region. And there is a distinction, and it'll become somewhat clear when I go through my slides. So that's one thing. The other thing is I can see a sea of faces or sea of boxes. So I might not know when you need to ask a question or need to stop me to ask something very specific. Just put it in the chat, and Victoria will be able to let me know that I should stop and address a question, or you can ask your questions at the end of the lecture, whatever suits you. All right. I am now going to start sharing my screen. And so all of you should see some really warm yellow sort of slides on top of a bed of flowers. And if you see that on your screen, yes, you're looking at my slides. So let's get started with what I want to talk about today. And obviously, my talk is designed for about 30 to maybe 40 minutes. I'm not going to get into depth about everything, but I am going to introduce you to a few concepts. The one thing that I would like you to take away from this talk, even if you don't remember anything else, I want you to take away the idea of the diversity that we have of wild bee species. Even in this little corner of the world, there's an amazing diversity of native wild bees. And I would like you to take that away from away from this talk, sorry. The other things that I'm going to talk about are the specific goals of the research projects that have happened in my lab. I'm going to talk about the types of gardens we study, and a little bit about methodology, the results that we observed, the discussion, and what my students and I hope to do with this information and apply this to the real world, and what the future of this research project looks like. Now, all of the work that I'm presenting, I have to acknowledge, is not done by me alone. It's done by a team of students who worked in my lab, either on their senior year projects, on their honors projects, as volunteers, or simply summer, experiences, okay? All right. Now, there are roughly 20,000 plus species of wild bees all over the world. And yet we remain fixated on one single species, all right? So most of the studies that you have are on the European honeybee, one of the representatives of the genus Apis. We are obsessed with that. Why? Because it's really important to us for managing agriculture. The European honeybee is not native to North America. However, it does play a very important role in agriculture. And I can talk about that later if you're interested. But there is a variety of diversity of bees that are not the honeybee. And we actually don't know much about most of them. That's an issue. So I think my favorite question that came yesterday, and it turns out it's Victoria's too, was somebody said I should explain pollination to their third grader or fourth grader. And I'm going to try. I don't teach third or fourth graders. I'm going to try. So what is pollination? Pollination is when the pollen from one flower is transferred to another flower. In the most simple way, that's what pollination is. Now, I'm guessing a fourth grader has not been exposed to all the details of the birds and bees, so I'm going to keep it as simple as that, instead of using all the technical terms. But what happens during pollination? Plants can't move. Flowers cannot move. So something has to take the pollen from one flower to another flower. And hopefully it is to the flower of an entirely different plant. All right? Meaning an entirely different plant of its own species. Something the flower looks very similar to the original flower from which the pollen was taken. How is pollination done? How is this transfer of pollen done? You can transfer it by wind. This is why in the springtime, many of us have allergies. Sometimes, you have volumes of pollen flowing around in the air. Many of the tree species out here use wind for moving pollen around between plants. But there are a large number of plants that actually use insects and other animals for moving around the pollen. How do they do it? They attract the insect or the animal to the flower. They promise it some nectar, something sweet. And that sweet nectar is usually at the base of the flower. As the insect goes in, all that pollen rubs off on the body. And the insect, and if you look at this, here's a bee, all right, covered with pollen. It takes it to another flower. And again, it's hunting out there for nectar. And the pollen rubs off on the plant. Pollination is really important. Why? Without pollination, you're not going to get most fruits. You're not going to get seeds. All right? You're not going to be able to plant new plants. So this is really important. Pollination happens through bees, bats, midges, flies, birds, even some species of mosquitoes, small mammals too. So that happens, but the key pollinator, actually the one that does most of the pollination the world over, is some species of bee or the other. So all the bees together are responsible for most of the pollination that happens the world over. So there are 20,000 species of bees on Earth, and there are about 4,000 in the continent of North America. This part of the world where I am, Canton, the Northeast, United States, has roughly 350 species, slightly over that. They're obligate pollinators. So this is that they actually consume pollen, they need it for their diet, it's a part of their nutrition. And because they require pollen, they're always rubbing up against that pollen, they're carrying it on their body, they have special sorts of body adaptations to carry the pollen, and hence they're called obligate pollinators. They have the specialized anatomy for pollen. So, for example, out here, you can see this bee going to the willow flower, and you can see this huge package of pollen it's carrying. And bees like the honeybee, for example, they will actually catch pollen on the hair on their body, the scopa, and they will then, with their mouth, they'll actually comb the pollen into tight little packets, and carry them in these depressions on their hind limbs called the corbicula. All right. Some other bees just carry them on their scopa, but but bees have these modifications that enable them to carry pollen. So the estimates for the kind of pollination that's carried out by wild bees, it's thought that it could be anything from the most conservative estimate is 60 to anything up to 90% of agricultural pollination is by native wild bees. Now, native wild bees, as compared to honeybees, are more resistant to disease. They are better adapted to the local environment. They are better buffered against habitat changes. They're not perfect, but it's thought that they are better able to buffer themselves against habitat changes and also climate change to a certain degree. They also have greater diversity, not just species diversity, even within each species, you have greater genetic diversity. And the diversity of bees means that they forage on different flowers. Some of them are generalists, they'll go to any kind of flower. Some of them are more specific, and the specificity actually plays a role. You want, like, if you've evolved to use a bee or a couple of bee species for pollination, you want them to keep visiting the flowers of your own species to ensure efficient pollination. It makes no sense for a bee to go to species A and then go to species B with all the pollen. That doesn't help it, because that's a species that species A doesn't recognize. So those are things to keep in mind. They have a variety of pollination behaviors. So, for example, some bees are able to pollinate tomatoes because they sonicate. It's like your electric toothbrush. They vibrate and it makes the pollen emerge. And that sonication is required for tomato flowers, for instance. They have different emergent seasonality. So what this means is that some bees might emerge early in the spring, some later in the summer. All right. And that means there's always some wild bee species around that pollinates plants. So that's the seasonality. And they also have asynchronous population dynamics, meaning that there can be populations that are in plenty at certain times of the growing season and less at other times. And just to give you an idea of the diversity of bees, you're looking at one of the smallest bee species out there, the genus Perdita. And here you're looking at one of the carpenter bees, Xylocopa. So that gives you an idea even about the size that you have in wild bees. All right. Everybody assumes that bees live as a social bunch. Actually, very few do. And Sam can back me up on this. Most bees tend to be solitary, coming together sometimes in aggregations. They could be communal or semi-social. It's only a few bee species that are eusocial. And by eusocial, it means like the honeybee, where you have a queen, worker bees, all these castes that are there, the drones, etc. The solitary bees are on their own. They come together to mate, but otherwise the female goes, lays the eggs, the fertilized eggs in, usually on the ground. Sometimes in twigs, depending on in the hollows of twigs, depending on which species. Sometimes you will see solitary bees come together in an area and aggregate for nests. Those are aggregations. There are bees that will share a common nest, but they'll create their own cells for their larvae to develop and the adult bee to finally develop. You also have semi-social bees where all the bees, the female bees, are able to reproduce. There might be a caste-like structure, but not a true caste. And then, of course, you have the typical, eusocial bee that you see in several bumblebee species, the honeybee, etc. Typically, the life cycle of a bee, bees emerge around, in these parts, around the end of March, early April. For me, what I watch out for is on campus, you have a lot of willows near the Johnson Hall of Science. When they start flowering is when I watch out for the first bees. And this will happen all the way till October. And then you see that the adults have died out. And what's happening is that many of the bees are either in their underground nests or in the hollow cavities or twigs. The adult female bee would have laid the egg, put in some provisions, a little packet of pollen, if you will, and then sealed it off. So they look like cells. They're actually called cells. And you can sometimes see there are estimates of at least bees from the tropics, etc., where this, the egg can remain unhatched for a couple of years. But generally speaking, what you see is the larva emerge, develop, and turn into an adult. So, and all of that happens during the summer. The adult bee lives anything from 1 month to about 3 or 4 months. Some bees come out all together at one time. Some bees come out throughout the summer,
So Aswini, we did have a question come through the chat
Yes.
about defining the difference between wild bees and domestic bees. So you might be getting into that, but that was just a question that came
Yes, I will actually show you a slide a bit later. So I just want you to keep in mind what we call domestic bees are European honeybees. These are the ones that farmers use, and there's a reason that honeybees are important to farmers. They can be controlled because they live in hives. They live in this eusocial sort of colony, and they can be transported from one place to another. They're also important because you have to keep in mind that some of the crops have been introduced to the United States. So we're just talking about the United States. For example, if you go to California, the almond crop, the flowers in the almond orchards come up before the native bees emerge. So having your honeybees to pollinate the almond flowers makes total sense. That's a farmer's way of thinking about it. So there are morphological features by which you can separate the European honeybee from the rest of the native bees. It does require a microscope, but I'll show you the feature. All right, there's a lot of research on bees, but most of it has taken place with the European honeybee. So when we are talking about things such as the colony collapse disorder, the issue with varroa mites, the issue with fungal diseases, etc., we are often referring to the European honeybee. And because in the lay literature, in all these magazine articles, etc., the panic over European honeybees was highlighted. Everybody assumes that's the only group out there, and that they sort of are representative of all the wild bees. In fact, the interest in wild bees started when scientists realized something was going on with the honeybees. So in the last 2 decades, suddenly scientists have started looking at, okay, can we have wild bees pollinating our crops? Can we pay more attention to the wild bees? Can they do the job that honeybees do? So there's some interesting pieces of research that were exciting to my lab. One of the things is, in places such as New York City, it shows that the proximity of urban gardens, flower gardens, communal vegetable gardens, etc., is correlated with a higher bee diversity in the area. This was very surprising that it came out of New York City. Bees seem to do okay in urban areas as long as there are lots of gardens. In urban California, there's a study where they showed that native bees like to visit specific ornamental plants. In rural Sweden, there are studies, there's at least one significant study that indicates that if you have in a rural area ornamental gardens and bee diversity, your fruit set as well as, the seed set, meaning the development of fruits and vegetables is enhanced. It's highly correlated to both bee diversity and the distance of your agricultural area from ornamental gardens. In reports from UK indicate that ornamental gardens are really important nesting sites for bumblebees. Right? So I will come back to these terms, ornamental gardens, and why they are different from agricultural sites shortly. Okay. My own study in my lab, and by my own, I also mean myself and my students. The aim that is there in my lab is to examine and compare native bee species abundance and richness in kitchen gardens, wildflower patches next to kitchen gardens, and ornamental gardens. So out here on the left side of the slide are the vegetable gardens of Monticello, Jefferson's estate. And these are the kitchen gardens. They're all vegetable crops for consumption. They try to recreate the plants that Jefferson planted in the vegetable garden. And on the right-hand side, you can see somebody who has their act together for ornamental gardens. I wish my garden would look like this, all right? It's an ornamental garden. So kitchen gardens, what are they? Generally in St. Lawrence County, they're roughly about 0.5 to 2 acres of land. The biggest that I've seen is about 5 acres, which are utilized for vegetable, fruit, and herb production. All right. They're not large-scale agricultural areas. They're often tended to by a family, and this is a socio-cultural phenomena. There are records of that with Native Americans practicing small-scale agriculture. But you start to see the modern day, the design of the kitchen gardens that you see in this part of the world, you can date it back to the settlers who came here with just seeds to start vegetable gardens. You also have some documentation of how slaves on plantations set up their own kitchen gardens. And the reason in all cases was for food security. So even if you are able to buy food from the market, having a kitchen garden supplements nutrition. It gives you the security of being able to grow your own food for your table. at a time when maybe you might not be able to access the market that easily. By their very nature, kitchen gardens are not monocultural. Very rarely does a kitchen garden have only one crop. Usually people are growing several crops together. Very rarely does a person who has a kitchen garden hire a honeybee hive. So they rely on wild bees. It's not worth it for them to hire a hive when all you have is a small plot of land. Now, here's the interesting thing. You have to keep in mind kitchen gardens are places where you both have native species as well as non-native species. Think about the origin of your crops. Where do many of your crops come from? All right. So, you know, kitchen gardens have an interesting mix of plant species in them. Ornamental gardens, unlike kitchen gardens, which are usually located to the side of the house or in the back of the house or whatever, or you know, in some sort of space where you can't see them, ornamental gardens serve an aesthetic purpose. They're usually located right in front of the house, and they create a complex web of social and ecological service. You know, if you think about it, the only thing that interests you in ornamental garden is the pretty flowers, or maybe the odd looking plant, so this is a fascinating phenomena. Many people put in so much money and resources into just the joy of looking at those flowers. Here's the interesting thing, though not well studied as a phenomena, the occasional study from Europe, the occasional study from elsewhere has indicated that in rural areas that are dependent on agriculture, like St. Lawrence County, you have these ornamental gardens actually provide floral resources, nectar, at a time when there's nothing flowering in a vegetable garden or a kitchen garden or in the agricultural farm. Again, out here, you see natives and non-natives being planted by people. What's going on in the wildflower patches? So I talked about wildflower patches that are next to kitchen gardens. This is something that Samantha Haab worked on. Sam, raise your hand. Yeah, so they are small areas of, small patches often that are just left there unmowed next to gardens, such as kitchen gardens, and they actually provide very vital nesting habitat. And we wanted to understand, one, the diversity of bees that visit kitchen gardens. Two, the diversity that visits these nearby wildflower patches. I mean, do wildflower patches actually make a difference or not? And thirdly, can ornamental gardens actually replicate what the wildflower patches are doing? So the methodology that my students and I have used is pretty much the same. So the study actually kicked off in 2012, and Houston and Lydia Horn were my first students to go on this crazy journey of bees with me. Houston went out, sampled soybean and alfalfa fields, because if you want the largest monocultures in St. Lawrence County, these are the ones. They are, it is a dairy economy, and soybean and alfalfa grown for the dairy industry. He went and sampled 6 sites, and then we compared what he had observed with Lydia's study, which was kitchen gardens, and she had 22 different sites. At the end of the study, I mean, I realized we had bitten off a bit more than we could chew, because she never wanted to look at another bee again. So she's gone into environmental education. She just got a PhD last year. Samantha came along and we did a more pragmatic set of sites, 12 sites, where she went and observed wildflower patches and compared the bee diversity in the wildflower patches to the garden itself. Raven Larcombe just finished her work in my lab, and she went out to sites that were either just ornamental gardens or kitchen gardens, or places where people had planted ornamental gardens next to kitchen gardens. What did we use? We used a technique called pan trapping, and I want you to look at this picture on the right-hand side, and you can see a set of bowls, blue, yellow, white. And what you have inside the bowls is soap water. This is true rocket science. It's so hard to set up. So it's Dawn dish detergent in water, and they kind of mimic flowers. Bees land on in these bowls of water, and they're trapped in there. Now, we capture less than 0.0001% of the bee community, but it gives us an idea of what kind of bees are coming to the kitchen garden or to the ornamental garden to pollinate these flowers. So there is no other way of studying the bees. I wish there was, but there isn't. So the other things my students did was they went, did floristic surveys, they identified the bees, we collated the data, and we did, a bunch of statistical analysis. But I'm just going to skim over some of that for you. So we put the pans out, those colored bowls. And of course, Sam will recall this, that there was water in each of those bowls at a certain depth, and the bee falls in, the surface tension of the water traps the bee. The bees are on field, they're frozen they're placed on ice, they're brought back to the lab, and we clean them, dry them, pin them, and then start identifying them using, using a microscope. This is a dissection scope. This is one of my students, Thoin, and this is her collection from an ornamental garden. And she is going to identify them using the microscope. We also carry out floristic surveys where students have gone out, identified plants, and counted numbers of flowers, number of flowers per plant, etc. All that exciting work that's associated with data collection. All right. Now, when you're looking at the bee under the scope, they all look so different from each other. So very different. So, but you do need a microscope to tell them apart, for the most part. And here's the leafcutter bee. And then here is, of course, the carpenter bee that I was talking about. So while bee identification means that you have to learn a big lexicon of words that are associated exclusively with insects, and some of them specifically with bees. And there is, fortunately for us, there is a dichotomous key to the bee species of this region that's been published out of Canada, and we use that. And you have to look at features such as on the forewing, how many cells are there, and these are veins that separate parts of the forewing. You have to count those. You look for things such as, does the hind leg have spurs or not? If it has spurs, you immediately know this is a honeybee. All right, so somebody asked, how do you know that it's a honeybee? Well, you look at it under a scope and you look for these spurs. All right. Sometimes the spurs can be hidden away, but that is the sign of a honeybee. How do you know it is a bumblebee? Of course, you could say that you look at it and the morphology, the appearance would tell you it's a bumblebee. But you actually look for something called the jugal lobe to discern a bumblebee. And all of this is why you do need to capture a small sample of the bees and take them back with you to the lab and use a scope so that you get it right. So some of the results, we brought back these specimens to the lab, we identified it to the genus level. Some of them we could identify to the species level, and I've continued some of the work that my students have done. However, I'm trying to get it corroborated by a systematist, a person who knows for sure that the way that I've identified it is absolutely right. In the meantime, even with the surety of the genus level, we've been able to collate the data and analyze it. And some of the results are what I'm going to talk about. So we see bee abundance. And by bee abundance, I mean the sheer numbers of bees, all right, remains pretty much consistent throughout the summer. So do the number of species that you see. However, the actual composition of the bee community changes. So if you're seeing 10 bees in the spring, 10 bee species in the spring, you're still going to see 10 bee species at the end of summer, or you might see 11 or 12. It remains within, plus minus a couple of species. What changes is it's not the same 10 that you were looking at the beginning of the summer. You're seeing a slightly different species composition. Of course, what was exciting was the first set of results that showed us that kitchen gardens have far greater bee diversity than the monocultures of alfalfa and soybean. All right. Even though those fields were large, the diversity of bees was greater in the kitchen gardens, which had a greater diversity of plants. Wildflower patches adjacent to kitchen gardens do serve as attractants. When you look at these wildflower patches, they have the same types of bees as the kitchen gardens. The wild bee visits, or rather the wild bee species you're finding in the kitchen gardens, is also related to wildflower abundance. Some of the sites which had combinations of ornamental and kitchen gardens tended to have far greater bee abundance than sites with kitchen gardens alone. Even though you have multiple species in a kitchen garden, you have to understand, as compared to even an ornamental garden, it's still not species, it's still species poor. So just a couple of data slides. Bee abundance, the total number of bees varied amongst kitchen gardens, ornamental gardens, and that combination of kitchen plus ornamental gardens. As you go through the sites and start looking at them, one of the things that you notice is that the laziest gardener had the best bees. I mean, best number of bees. He was not weeding his garden. He had no structure or symmetry to anything. He had popped in plants wherever he thought he wanted to. And he had this very slapdash way of tending to his garden. And he had the greatest diversity of bees. He had the greatest numbers of bees. It was as if there was a complete bee party going on at his place. You can see that this is that bar that's PS, and the rest are, they only have about 50% of the bees that he has at the most. So that was very interesting, and he was totally gleeful because he felt guilty that he hadn't been tending his garden, but he was very happy, and now he leaves a bee for his bees. All right. The plant species richness also, strangely enough, remained consistent at all of these sites throughout the summer. So it varied across the sites, so if you go back to that site, yes, there was a difference in the number of species across all of these sites. PS had also not only the most number of bees, he also had the most number of different plant species. So floristic resources, so if you look at the number of flowers that were blooming, number of flower heads, etc., that varied throughout the summer across the sites as well. Ornamental gardens and sites that were combined had overlap in species richness, but ornamental gardens had greater species diversity than just kitchen gardens. So if a kitchen garden was combined with an ornamental garden, there seemed to be greater species diversity of bees. This was not something I was expecting. I thought ornamental gardens are full of non-native species. I would think that the number of bees out there would be just about the same as the kitchen gardens, but there was a huge statistical difference out there. Of course, the takeaway is, greater plant species diversity implied there would be a robust bee population, a robust diversity of bees. So this is what I was talking about. When you look at kitchen gardens, ornamental gardens, and ornamental gardens alongside kitchen gardens, you find that the diversity of the combination gardening actually enhances the bee diversity. All right, it might not be significantly different from just plain ornamental gardens, but it's definitely very different from the kitchen garden on its own. So if you want to attract bees to your kitchen garden, plant pretty flowers next to it. When we compared the results with our wildflower patches, we found that the results was very similar to what we had seen. The results from ornamental gardens was very similar to what we had seen in the wildflower patches. So we know that we have at least 62 native bee species and 25 genera from the kitchen garden study. Samantha, who was braver and went through, the species of bees. Now, bees are relatively easy to get down to the genus level, so to a broad identification. But to get down to the species level takes a lot of patience and bravery. And Samantha Hab was awesome at this. Raven, who had sampled in 2019 and was working on her bees, found 21 genera, but as she was trying to identify to the species level, we were hit by the pandemic and had to close the lab down. So we just worked with her genera identification. All right, what did we find? We looked at the 5 most common or most frequent sort of bees that you find. What stood out in all 3 studies was a similar pattern. You had this group of bees. They're the sweat bees, Lacio glossum, that stood out. The small bees, they will sometimes land on your skin, very harmless bees. They like the taste of salt. There are all these incredible pictures photographers have taken of Lacio glossums drinking the tears of like tortoises and stuff like that. They like that salty taste. Lacio glossums tend to be generalists. That is, they'll go to any type of flower. There are many species of Lacio glossums. They'll go to any type of flower to take nectar, and because of that, they end up pollinating a lot of species. They also emerge throughout the growing season. It's a really important group of bees. So the types of species change. There's always a Lacio blossom hanging around, but it's a different species. If you look at Lacio blossom, there are about 290 species in North America. They are asynchronous generalists. That means that they go to any flower and they come up at all kinds of random times throughout the growing season. The one thing we also have to be cautious about when we are interpreting our data, and all people who study bees acknowledge it, they are very trap happy. They like to come to the pan traps. So it might be also we are capturing a bit more than we should. There were several genera that were represented by only 1 or 2 specimens and occurred only during a certain time during the summer. We found that in this region, you have mostly solitary bees. You do have some eusocial, social, and kleptoparasitic bees. These are bees that like to put their eggs into other bees' nests. They call kleptoparasites. St. Lawrence Valley has a lot of heterogeneity, all right? We are on, we are bound on the southern end by the hills of the Adirondacks, and then you are getting into the St. Lawrence River. And this means that there's a wide range of potential niches for bees. Much of my study has been in and around the Canton-Potsdam area. I do want to expand and see if you're seeing similar patterns, for example, near Messina, and if I can pull the funds together, go all the way and look at what's happening in the Thousand Islands area, you know. If you go back to this slide and actually look at the data and bee counts, you'll notice that Raven's study from 2019 had a much smaller bee catch. And this is because we had a lot of rain in the 2019 summer. It was one of the rainiest summers that I've seen. Cloudy weather affects bee activity. Bees don't come out if there's no sun. Studies have shown that bees use the sun for orienting their navigation. So though we had differences in the numbers that we caught for these 3 types of studies, the trends that we saw, that diversity of plants is important, that you are seeing that the numbers remain consistent throughout the summer, except the species changes. Those kind of trends remain similar in all 3 studies. So some of the takeaways, I'm in the process of finishing my analysis of the information, writing up the data. Some of the things that are useful to consider for yourself, some of the things that you could think of. 1, ornamental gardens can serve as vital resources to support local bee populations. But this comes with a rider. What you plant in the gardens is important on many levels. And we can discuss that at the end of my presentation. Leaving wildflower patches be next to your agricultural site, not mowing it down, leaving it be next to your kitchen garden is really important, because it serves as the window dressing that attracts bee species into your kitchen gardens. It's also that buffer that keeps them interested even when your kitchen garden is not flowering. Wildflower patches and ornamental gardens seem to have similar bee species. There seems to be an overlap in some of the species that you find in the wildflower patches and also in the ornamental gardens. There's a little bit of overlap, at least in Canton. This might very well be different for non-rural areas. The one interesting thing that I found in the studies, we had such a huge number of sites for the kitchen garden study, 22 sites, we couldn't find the diversity of vegetable species being correlated strongly with bee diversity. Instead, it seemed that location played a role, how messy the site was. That is, the less managed the site was, the greater the bee abundance. The bees were happy if you just let the site be. So if you're trying to avoid weeding, you can now have a great excuse that you're doing it for the bees. So that's another take-home point. So what am I hoping to do with all of this? One, yes, it's very exciting as a biologist to learn to identify bees, to tell apart bee parts, teach my students about that, all of this exciting stuff. But I also believe that somewhere along, we need to give back to the community, all right? So what I'd like to be able to do in a couple of years is come up with local talks about bee-friendly garden recommendations, along the local planting calendar, which can overlay over the planting calendar. The other things that I have is talk to farmers about the importance of floral resources, not just within their kitchen gardens or not just within their agricultural farms, but how important it is maybe to plant a few flowers next to your fields or your kitchen gardens. The long-term data, is there's no work on local bees done in the St. Lawrence Valley. What we are doing, that's my lab is doing, is setting up a baseline sort of data bank, which over time, as we keep adding to it, we can figure out which bee species is in decline or might be rising and look at the reasons behind that. So those are some of the applications that are there. So what's the future work that's going to happen? So I'm hoping to finish IDing all my specimens to the species level. I just raised some funds to digitize these specimens. I'm able to send those digitized images out and get things identified. My students are total gangsters, So I am going to be co-publishing with all of them. I would like to understand better bee specificity as related to plant species. Like I said, bee-friendly planting calendars. I want to understand bee nesting sites. This is very poorly studied. We all assume all that bees want is food. So it's all about the flowers. In reality, bee nesting sites are also important. And that is something I would like to study. I'd like to study if habitat diversity is important, what role anthropogenic disturbance plays. So, digitizing specimens, long-term database for monitoring, all of this will remain. And so I would like to acknowledge all my students who worked on the project. Some of them have gone on to graduate school. Raven's working on pollination ecology in Virginia. Lydia finished her PhD, is doing a postdoc in Colorado. Samantha, I know, is going to go to graduate school, even if she thinks she's not going to go. Houston is an extension worker in Colorado. Thoyne has gone to graduate school in Albany, and Erica is also pursuing her PhD and in Montana. So these are all the others, are all the growers. There are people like, from the McNair program who've helped the students, grants that have helped the lab out, and I'm grateful for all of that. All right, Victoria.
Awesome. So I know there is some interest in that picture of the bee-friendly plants. So that's definitely of interest. So that might be something I collect from you, Aswini, and maybe we can send to interested people.
Yeah, I mean, you're welcome to have the picture. That's the thing. But more than the picture, there's actually somebody had asked, I mean, not somebody, there were multiple people who asked, I'm in this place, I'm in that place, what do I plant? And there is actually a website by the, it's the wildlife, I'll send the link to Lydia, I'm sorry, to Victoria, and she can send it around to all of you. But basically you punch in your zip code and it tells you what kinds of plants you might want to plant in that area. And it is still a beta version. It is, it's the Wildlife Service. I forget this thing, but they've done a really good job. They've teamed up with Doug Tallamy, who talks about why you should be planting natives in your garden. You know, Doug Tallamy is all about, you don't have to go halfway across the world to Africa to save, like, you know, the species there. Why don't you just start with your small little backyard? And he says more less, which I support, you know. More less, weed less, don't rake your leaves, and plant natives. Some of you asked, where can I get the natives from? You want to go to whoever you buy your plants from locally and ask for native plants. If you can't find the same species as what you have in that area, try and find a close relative that is not too non-native. So if it might be violets, it might be red buds, whatever it is, check out what you can work with locally. I understand gardening is a hobby. Some people get into it for, the sort of the love of the peculiar plants. That's fine too. That's absolutely okay. Maybe you could compensate for that by, not mowing your backyard.
So we did get a question from Dale about what is the state of our global bee population today, close to extinction, threatened, or what is the situation today in our world of climate change?
So unfortunately, we actually don't have enough information, all right? Because of these 20,000 bees and people just waking up more recently. Everybody has started realizing that if the bees go, so will most of our agriculture. It's estimated that 1 out of every 3 tablespoons of food that you eat is thanks to bees. So what we know right now in the United States is 9 species of bees are critically, not 9, sorry, 8 species of bees are critically endangered. And 7 of those are from Hawaii. All right, they are the Hawaiian yellow-faced bees. Then there is the rusty patch bumblebee. The IUCN, which is the agency that monitors internationally all these populations of species, has only listed a few bees out of these 20,000. It acknowledges 9 critically endangered species, and 8 of those are the US species. So the USA is doing some research on the bees, and that's why they know those numbers. There are 18 endangered and 16 species vulnerable. I thought I'd switch this off. Anyways, the global population is not known. What we do know, what studies have shown, at least in North America, is that the range of many of the bee populations in the south has shrunk. And when you are removing habitats, when you're opening up habitats like the, Escalante Park, etc., you're threatening, havens for many of these wild bees. That is true. So that is unfortunately the state of the global bees. We don't know. What we do know is habitat fragmentation affects wild bees. Climate change has affected wild bees. I think Samantha asked a question, do you know if the bee population is declining in the North Country around here? I can't say from the data that I have that I've noticed trends. I won't know for another few years, but I do know this one thing. There's a study out of Cornell University that in this part of New York, they have seen a decline in bumblebee populations because they have information over 50 years. So since since the 1950s, we've actually seen a decline in bumblebee populations. So the problem with bees is if you go outside of, outside of a few research institutions, most people are obsessed with the honeybee. Nobody's looking at wild bees. All right.
All right, and I see that, Chrissy, you have your hand up. So if you have a question and want to come off mute, okay. Was it about the picture? Okay, just checking. Awesome. Someone did ask about, it's from Bob and Nancy. They asked, did you track wildflower patches next to kitchen gardens and bee diversity? They only noticed slides about ornamental gardens and kitchen gardens.
Actually, that was Sam's work. Sam did look at wild bees in wildflower patches as well as in kitchen gardens, and she compared the species, and the wildflower patches are really important for attracting bees. Any others?
Yes, it looks like Taylor Hall has asked a question. They're wondering, since honeybees are introduced by farmers, are they or could they become an invasive species? Or do they compete with wild bee populations for nectar or habitat?
So that is $1 million question. So do they compete, as in, do they become invasive? Not really. You do have the odd rebel bee hive, suddenly the bee will split and they'll go off and make their own hive somewhere else. You do have issues like that. And there are some runaway bees that are around in Canton too. That being said, that's not very common. That's not the issue. The problem comes from, people have asked the question, is there resource competition? Are they competing for flowers? The data is still forthcoming, but what's more important is there's a study out from 2019 that shows that there is the transmission of disease from the honeybees to native wild bees when they visit flowers. So native wild bee that's infected with some pathogen goes into a flower, and it's a wildflower, and then comes a wild bee. The wild bee can pick up the virus, the fungus, you name it. Also, even though honeybees are not the object of my study, I do read up on some of the issues that have been highlighted. One of them is that the impact of pesticides that shows up in honeybees is indicative of what can happen or what is happening in wild bees. Any others, Victoria?
We did have one about which of the bee-friendly plants are deer resistant. So I don't know if you know that, but
no, I don't off the top of my head.
No worries.
I wish I did.
Yeah. And then one of our final ones is what percentage of wild bees nest or live underground versus in an above ground location?
That is an excellent question. And that's something that I hope to, climb up back on my soapbox and talk about. Roughly about 70 to 75% of North American bees nest under the ground. All right. Most people mistake wild bees for wasps. and try and destroy these underground nests. Now, wild bees rarely get as angry as wasps do, all right? Which means that they don't bite. The male bees don't sting. The female bees, they have to be really provoked before they attack. So there are two things. One, make sure that if you are worried about a nest, that it's actually not a wild bee nest before calling in pest control or dumping a bunch of chemicals onto your lawn. The second thing is, think about this. Can you let that corner of your lawn just be, not mow it? You know, just put a pretty fence around it and just pretend that it's a little garden of its own making. That's something that I would encourage. Reduce mowing as far as possible. I saw Chrissy taking pictures.
And I think one of our final questions here is, are your students seeing any local farmers using mason bees or leaf cutter bees?
Not leaf cutter bees, and I don't know if my students have necessarily observed them, but yes, we've run into people making mason bee houses, you know, those little tube-like things for mason bees to reside in. I'm going to go over the questions some people had posed. I don't know if people are here, the ones who asked these questions. Where do you start buying natives? Go to the person who sells you plants. Go to the little horticulturist and start insisting that they carry natives. Start asking them for natives. Ask them to get it. Is honey safe from contaminants? Actually, no. The thing is that it might not be at a concentration that you should worry about, but it's definitely at a concentration that bees might be sensitive to. So by contaminants, I think the question was referring to the pesticides. Somebody asked about the bee fungus. So again, this is a honeybee question, and you're talking about the chalk brood. There is a bunch of fungi. There are several strains that can infect honeybees, but right now the worry seems to be chalk brood. And I asked a beekeeper friend of mine here locally, and he said, you need to get, if you want to start a bee colony, contact a person who has good bee management practices and who has nice, clean hives. That's how you start. And then you have to make sure that you are practicing good management. Somebody did already ask about the declining trend in the populations of bees. Like I said, we have no idea about global trends, but at least in North America, we should be worried that the habitat range of the bees in the South is decreasing. And we know that the bumblebee population is declining up in northern New York. All right, any other questions?
All right, lots of, this has been very interesting and informative. So certainly, Aswini, thank you very much. If people want to, put up the clapping emoji, we really appreciate your time this evening, and this was really informative. And yeah, I certainly love being able to see all the faces here and learn new things. So, if there are any other supplemental questions, certainly feel free to send them along. I can direct them to Aswini and we can kind of get those questions answered. But again, it's been a lovely evening with everyone. And we hope to see you at our next Laurentians Learn soon. So have a good night, everyone.
It's lovely to meet all
Thank
of
you very much.